One look at Guernica is sufficient to convey the depth of anti-war sentiment felt by its creator, Pablo Picasso. The strength of his revulsion is shown in the twisted and contorted figures of innocent civilians and animals who've been subjected to a brutal slaughter. And yet, just a few months prior to the painting's unveiling, Picasso had had very little intention of producing such a work. In 1937 he'd been commissioned by Spain's Republican government to produce a mural-sized painting to display at the Paris International Exposition later that year. Though he graciously accepted the commission, Picasso had initially been at a loss as to what to paint. Spain was in the throes of a civil war at the time, the Republic under siege from the fascist forces of Generalissimo Franco, and in the April of that year a momentous and tragic event took place that fixed Picasso's mind once and for all on what he would paint. With assistance in the war effort being offered to the fascists by Nazi Germany, Franco called for the Luftwaffe to undertake an aerial bombing of the small Basque country town of Guernica. Up to 1,600 civilians were killed and many hundreds more injured. The world was outraged. Picasso, exiled in France, read of the atrocity from his apartment in Paris and set to work immediately. The painting measures an astonishing 25.5 feet by 11.5 feet. It's rendered in grey and black tones, reflecting the grim nature of its message and giving it the feel of a photojournalism report. There's no fixed focal point in the painting, rather the entirety of it hits you full on. There's no avoiding the carnage wherever you look, just as there was no escape for the civilians from the horror that rained down on them from the skies that day. We see 6 human figures in the painting, including a woman with a dead or dying baby in her arms, and 2 animals, a horse and a bull. Only the bull appears defiant and unmoved, perhaps acting as a symbol of Spanish stoicism. Picasso had long since been an influential figure in 20th century art, but over 30 years had elapsed since he'd helped found the Cubist movement. His subsequent involvement in surrealism had not been as pivotal. To many it seemed his most productive years were behind him. And then he paints Guernica. And I love that this painting, above all others, marks the high watermark of his career. It's his magnum opus, and its political message has only grown in power as time has moved on. I love the scale of this painting, both in its physical dimensions and in its lack of compromise. Picasso remained in Paris during the Second World War, well aware that his art was not favoured by the occupying German forces. No doubt Guernica had played a big part in that. There is a story that Picasso was regularly bothered by the Gestapo at this time, and on one occasion, during a search of his apartment, an officer saw a photograph of Guernica on display. "Did you do that?" the officer asked. "No," replied Picasso, "you did." Franco's forces won the day in the Civil War, of course, and Guernica was taken out of the country so it could be used to rally support for Spanish refugees. It crossed the Atlantic and ended up in the USA, where it remained for many years, only returning to Spain in 1981, 6 years on from Franco's death and the birth of modern Spanish democracy. Picasso himself had died in 1973, but the painting remains his most famous and perhaps his most important work.